rush up and down the stairs every 2 minutes, but there we are. We get started and we start.
We cannot be responsible for another place. But we...
Oh, I don't know. People hold me responsible for all sorts of things. Well, why not that?
Gosh, is this all your team?
If the gallery is in...
It's getting bigger by the day, I tell you. We're now up to 650 people in the department. It's all your fault. You have to take them all on, you see.
I think, in the words of a certain fictional figure, I couldn't possibly comment. What I can comment on more positively is that you, Secretary of State, are very welcome. It is very useful for this committee to keep briefed on the state of play, to continue to seek to elicit information from you, as we shall do this afternoon, and to listen to where we are. Self-evidently, the pace is quickening. We understand that. Our purpose is not, as it were, to add to the problem, but it is to throw a spotlight on the issues of concern to us and arguably to others. I think you're very well familiar with the rules of engagement, public evidence session, being televised, all on the record. We will send you a transcript thereafter. We are conscious of your time constraints and very grateful for your attendance. And we will be as crisp in proceeding with this as we can. I thought to kick off, it might help if I asked you, Secretary of State, since that quite memorable press conference, joint conference with Michel Barnier on the 19th of March, could you update us on negotiations on the withdrawal agreement? I think in particular, trying to compress the concern, how it interacts with the focus, pace and structure of negotiations leading up to the June Council, and beyond that looking ahead to October and beginning to get to decision time on the withdrawal agreement. And I think if you want to throw in a comment at this point, given recent events in both houses, there is clearly a parliamentary aspect to how you can brief and how you might want to reflect that in your answer.
When you started, my Lord Chairman, you reminded me that when that famous comment about I couldn't possibly comment was made, it was at the beginning of a television programme about the Whip's office, and you and I were both new government whips at the time.
Yes, and reverting to that role momentarily, I need to draw the Secretary's attention to the fact that there is a division in
I thought the ringing wasn't just tinnitus, right? But I remember saying at the time, and I'll dash off and dash back, that we both started the Whip's office and nobody knew what we did. After that programme was launched, they thought they knew what we did. You know, it's a bit like this job too. I'll be back as quickly as I can.
Thank you. We fully understand. Please.
The proceeding is currently suspended.
Run 10 miles without breaking sweat a long past, Mr. Chairman.
Well, in order to enable you to get your breath back, I will just say that on one occasion when we were whips together, I had been at this end, coincidentally, and not prospectively, I assure you, the committee, but I needed to get back as our division bell went in the Commons, and I overtook a rather distinguished member of this House who was a rather well-known athlete on my way to the debate. I don't think we would either wish to repeat that, nor do I need to repeat question one. What we basically asked for was a sit-rep on developments since the post-19th March press conference and a sort of indication of the time and the modalities of how it's going in the next month or two.
Yes, I remember the questions, my Lord. The first thing to say is, I guess the best summary was Michel Barnier, who said that we are at 75% a couple of weeks ago, but the last 25% is the hardest. Yeah. So that's the sort of summary position. I mean, in essence, we've locked down the whole chapters on citizens' rights and finance, which obviously is very important. But we have outstanding, and we're working on this literally. I mean, my officials, not today, because today's a bank holiday in Brussels, but generally speaking, they've been in Brussels a considerable amount of the time. The outstanding areas that are not locked down are obviously Northern Ireland, which people know about, but also some elements of remaining separation issues, which I'll come back to in a second, and also the governance of the agreement, which sounds very bland, but actually is quite controversial because of the wish on one side to have European Court involved and our wish to have it impartial and so on. So that's the sort of basic position. Northern Ireland, clearly is highly controversial. We stand by the words used in the joint report in December, but we don't agree with the Commission's interpretation of that. We think what they have proposed is something that, in the words of the Prime Minister, no British government could agree to. In effect, a division of the kingdom down the Irish Sea, and we are still working on our response to that. On separation issues, the teams are still working through, and I'll just list them for you, I've got them here actually, intellectual property, customs VAT, Euratom, public procurement, ongoing judicial cooperation in civil and commercial matters. And we think we're going to get resolution of those, the easier parts if you like, by June, but the main aim is October. Now, at the same time, because the March Council laid down guidelines for the future partnership, future economic partnership, we have been endeavouring to come to an agreement with the Commission as to how we approach that. As you know from history, the Commission is very keen on its sequencing and so on. We want to do this in parallel, a large number of parallel streams. We haven't quite numbered them all yet, but over 40, I think. And we expect them to agree that because, again, Michel Barnier said back in March that they expected to do the future partnership in a series of parallel negotiations. So that's how it's been. That's really what's been happening since then, and we are literally at the point of talking about that, the structure of that last piece.
Just very briefly before we pass on to colleagues. I take it from the way you've presented that you would see the framework for future relationship, however it's formally integrated or considered with the withdrawal agreement in its legal form and a decision is taken on it, as being a rather important granular document which will have to contain more than a few political aspirations.
The future, yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, the Article 5 requires the withdrawal agreement to take into account its phrase is, as you say, the framework of the future relationship, but we take the view that's got to be pretty substantive. How can you take into account something which is just a few airy-fairy aims? It has to take that into account. Also, I mean, you mentioned Parliament's role in this. Parliament will vote more than once on the withdrawal agreement, and I would be surprised if parliamentarians were happy to vote for the expenditure of, 35 to 39 billion pounds without knowing, as it were, what we're getting for it. I mean, it's not quite a fair legal description, but nevertheless, people will see it in those terms. And so I think it would be quite difficult to get the withdrawal agreement through the House if we don't have it substantively down. But also, there's one other thing which I think is important to understand in terms of the sequencing of this. The implementation period is supposed to be just that, the implementation period. It's not supposed to be an ongoing bit of further negotiation. And if you have an implementation period for businesses, they need to know at the beginning of the implementation period what it is they're going to implement. So we have to have it pretty much nailed down, even legally, at the beginning of the implementation period. It won't be ratified because they can't sign a deal with us until we're a third country. So that'll be shortly after the formal departure from the Union. But the ratification process will take place during that period as well. But so in order to have it all done, we really have to be very, very substantively there in October, in sort of joint report type terms, and there in legal terms pretty much by the time we leave.
Thank you. I think I'll go straight on to Baroness Kennedy.
Hello, Inspector Smith. Will it be possible to get a draft legal text of the withdrawal agreement in time for the June meeting?
Well, we're aiming for October. There's been a degree of talk about June having to be. That wasn't how it was laid out in March, and but of course we're used to this. the Commission likes to use time pressure in this exercise, and we're going to get there as fast as we can. But one of the different...
But you're saying no to June?
I'm saying I can't guarantee June, is what I'm saying.
And you think it's unlikely?
Let me explain the structure, and then you can draw your conclusions. The withdrawal agreement includes on Northern Ireland A, B, and C. Now, there's a lot of argument about C, which is the fallback option, but we take the view that actually we need to address all three. And A depends to a very large extent on what the substantive future economic partnership agreement is. If we have a tariff-free free trade agreement and a light-touch customs agreement, that makes Northern Ireland very much simpler than if we don't have those things. Yeah, sure. So it's all three we want. We don't just want the one, because the truth be told, I would consider it not a success if we were falling back on option C. I can see why the Irish government want it as a guarantee, but we have to have all three, not just the one. Now, whether we can do that by June, I am not at all sure, but we're certainly aiming to complete it easily by October.
And you're saying early October?
Yeah.
Your letter of the 19th of April states that the dispute resolution mechanism for the withdrawal agreement must respect the autonomy and integrity of both the UK and the EU.
Yeah.
What does that really mean in practice?
Well, one of the things, the issues that we expect to come up, let me go back a second. Firstly, it means in practice it needs to be impartial. It can't be the court of one or another. It couldn't be the Supreme Court, and it couldn't be the European Court. Yeah. So it's got to be the Joint Committee and some sort of specialist support committees. It's going to be quasi-judicial. I think probably. Yeah. I mean, we are still in negotiation on this, of course. This is an area where it's not one of the green areas. It's an area where we haven't yet. I can't remember the element. It's 125 or something like that. So it's still in discussion, but it's got to be something like that, I think. It's obviously the Union wants the European Court to do it because they see it as a sort of extension of EU law. We don't. We see it as a sort of encapsulated access to single market and so on. And obviously EU law will apply to the country in single market issues and so on during that period, but not in our view to the overarching.
And I just wondered how you imagined intractable disputes being resolved. There are different kinds of disputes. There are going to be the trade disputes, and you're recognising that there's going to have to be some sort of trade system, a quasi-court, whatever you want to call it, tribunal or arbitration tribunal or something. But there's going to have to be a quasi-court for that, for trade. I think we've recognised that you're going to have something similar to deal with security issues and the Euro warrant, because Europe's insisting that freedom of you're a great man for civil liberties, as we together fought. We battled those things together. But the civil liberties of individuals and their when liberties at stake, you need to have a court. And again, it's going to have to be one that's outside of either of our nations, and therefore, on Euro warrant issues and security issues, there's going to have to be a court for that too, isn't there?
Well, my expectation, and this applies to Euro warrants, privacy issues, data, is that in essence we'll have to, as it were, have a choice of your terminology rather than mine, a sort of choice of forum, as it were.
Choice of forum, yeah.
And the forum will be dictated by where the issue arises. So on data gathered in Europe, I'd expect the ECJ to have a say on that. Where the data gathered here, I expect that to be a Supreme Court issue. Basically, we've got to have a divider there somewhere. Now,
but we would go to the ECJ when we're involved in a dispute on data to do with data that affects us coming from Europe.
Something from Europe. Or it's the other way around, I think. Somebody saying the Brits should not have my data,
yes.
They would take it to the ECJ.
Okay.
And it happens.
So there's a role for the ECJ there. And then you need to have there's going to have to be some kind of quasi-court for agencies, for the things like Euratom and where disputes might arise in relation to things like medicine controls or aviation matters. You're going to have some kind of...
Let me take aviation's sort of well-documented example. I mean, we have said that we are interested in being a part of EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency. Now, the Swiss have an associate membership of that. What that allows to happen is for the Swiss equivalent of the Civil Aviation Authority to be able to certify aircraft, for example, make judgments on safety and so on, and that is tested in the Swiss court, and they've got that arranged. Now, I think we're going to have a struggle to negotiate it, but that's what we're aiming for.
So we need
like
a court for that, or a decision on the court.
There will always, I think, most of these things will have some sort of arbitration structure. Generally, as you say, quasi-judicial or judicial, and we're going to have to negotiate them piece by piece. Under the overarching requirement, we're not going to allow the ECJ to have, say, inside the UK, but issues to have outside.
But we will have,
same as if we went to the States and
so
we were extraditing someone to the States.
No, I know, but that's different, you see, because we've had the benefit for extradition of the Euro warrant here, which is very easy, and as you know, extradition to the United States or other countries can be lengthy processes that can take over years. So there's an aspect of this that people want to retain, which is about the ease of the Euro warrant for trafficking, for all kinds of.
The reason I stayed off the Euro warrant was the European arrest warrant, was because, of course, we are debating that at the moment, and there are constitutional issues within the European Union on individual rights of members, citizens of member states, where historically they have not extradited their own citizens. So we have to get past that before we actually know what the sort of oversight rate is.
So we're going to be looking at multiple dispute resolution mechanisms.
Could well be.
It could
well be.
Yeah. In your letter,
as we do now, to some extent.
In your letter to us on the 19th of April, you stated that the issue on onward movement rights has not been forgotten.
No.
And that we will seek a final deal on this. I mean, that we know what we're talking about here. We're talking about our citizens in other parts of Europe who, have enjoyed freedom of movement, and what's going to happen about that right.
Right. There are two outstanding citizens' rights that sort of carry forward. One of which we can probably resolve. One of which we'll have to do bilaterally. The bilateral one, to put it to one side, is voting rights, which we haven't got agreed. The onward movement, particularly important in the Low Countries, where you've got lots of borders, you've got people working on one side and living on another, that sort of thing, or wanting just to move a few miles and be in another country. But also, I didn't realise until recently, it also applies quite a lot to even the retirement community, who may move to a more economic place to live. Good luck to them. So this is an important right. Now, we think the resistance of the Commission to dealing with this in the withdrawal agreement was they saw this as a future, an ongoing relationship, and they were very, very, very resistant to dealing with any ongoing relationship in the withdrawal agreement. So this comes up again in the future economic partnership.
So that's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
So that's still not resolved.
Yeah, we haven't restarted it yet, but yes.
And I just wanted finally to ask you about, other than Northern Ireland and Ireland. What do you see as the real sticking points that you're looking at, that give you the tossing in the bed at night?
Nothing keeps you awake at night, I tell you.
Oh, really? Lucky you.
Yeah, but it's quite hard to sort of pick one off because they change. So to take Ireland looked like it was sort of semi-resolved in the last part of last year.
Until we unpicked it and showed that, in fact, some of these ideas about technology can deal with all of this have shown themselves to be rather...
I think if we may interpose...
Not quite true.
Okay. But what are the sticking points that you see?
Beyond
Ireland, forget Ireland.
I would expect during the course of the negotiations on the economic partnership, we'll have something of a tussle over financial services, the extent of the financial services chapter, but bear in mind the views inside Europe are not uniform on that. The views of Luxembourg are probably different to those of France. So that would, I expect, to be...
So financial services.
I would think to be
Any more?
Services more generally. Bear in mind that we are a big service exporter, probably one of the biggest in the world these days, and so things like professional qualifications will be an issue.
Yeah.
You know, with that. We may well get back pressure on migration issues and so on, but that may tie into things like professional qualifications. I can't give you a wholly exhaustive list because it would take me a while, but that's the sort of thing I think we would expect to have some issues with. On the wider scope of the security and defence side of things, that will be about, to give you an example of where we may run into issues. I don't know how much you followed the Galileo episode.
Oh, yes.
Yes? Where we don't think the European side of this negotiation has behaved quite as we expected, let's put it that way. And where we have been told that we will not have access to certain secure information. Now, that sort of thing may just pop up. It's a good example of something that popped up unexpectedly.
I think at that point we might just move on. I think that's a useful exchange, and I'm sure the committee will want to return to some of those topics again. Baroness Wilcox.
Good afternoon, Secretary of State.
Afternoon.
We put it to you in our letter of the 21st of March that under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the UK will, on the 29th of March 2019, enter into a number of legally binding commitments. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right.
You do? That's good. Michel Barnier is on record as saying that formal negotiations on future UK-EU relations will only start after March 2019. Do you agree with that as well?
Formal negotiations start? No, I don't agree with that. No, I think he's conflating two things. We are starting the negotiations right now, but the actual signature of the treaty will be not until then, because they can only sign with a third party, and as Lord J knows better than most, I guess. And so what I'll be aiming to do is actually conclude the negotiation, if I can get to that point by then, and then so they can sign and then start the ratification process. Remember, ratification is going to require a brand new European Parliament, who've only just been elected at that point, or will be being elected at that point, a brand new Commission, and almost certainly, for some of it at least, if not all of it, to be a mixed agreement, so it will go around the parliaments of Europe. So it's got quite a lot to get done in ratification terms, and we absolutely have to have ratification concluded before the implementation period's over. Otherwise, we're in a sort of limbo.
Thank you.
And is there a danger that, given that Brexit is obviously the preoccupation of this country, other member states may take a rather different view of priorities, and they will be concerned about the political debates in their country and the EP and the Commission,
of course.
And that we might lose way on that. This is why. Is that the reason that you're anxious to get up front on?
No, I think the first thing to say is it is definitely the case that Brexit is not the priority in the majority, certainly the vast majority of the 27, that it is here.
If I can interpose for a moment for the record, we were talking to Benelux parliamentarians yesterday, and I wouldn't like to give the impression that they were not concerned about the Brexit issue.
Well, that I guess is the sort of stark exception. There are countries or sectors or even provinces for which Brexit is, I would say existential, but incredibly important. Now, the Benelux countries you mentioned, the littoral states, Belgium and the Netherlands in particular, have got a very, very high investment in cross-channel trade. So there are estimates around, I don't know, I can't speak for the veracity of them, that put impacts of so-called hard Brexit on their economies of 3 to 4%. So quite big numbers. Now, if you are a government dealing with that as a risk, it may not be your top agenda item, but it's been quite close to it. Others, in different ways, in Germany, for example, Germany, of course, got very strong views on this process, but it might be slightly different in Bavaria, where Bavaria's got enormous trade with us, whether it's BMWs or Airbuses or indeed agricultural products, in which all of which they major. So it varies, and part of my task really is to make sure that each individual country is aware of its own interest in Brexit. It isn't automatic that they necessarily know. And so that's why I think in the run-up to March, I think I went to 18 countries from memory. And it was very, very useful because it actually delivered back both information to me, but also had an influence effect on their interest in what that March Council guidelines look like.
I think we ought to draw the committee's attention to the timing issues and the salient sequencing of this first, and then I know one or two colleagues want to come on afterwards as well on their points. Baroness Faulkner next.
You said a little bit earlier in reply to Baroness Kennedy that Parliament would want to know what the €39 billion what it was getting for that. I was slightly taken aback by that reply because that money relates to commitments that are under this current multi-annual financial framework. So it's not what we'll get in the future, it's what we are getting today.
The second half of the sentence was, that's not a legal description.
Okay. So
that was the point I was making.
So let's not raise expectations that money will be used to leverage...
No, with respect. Nobody's raising expectations, but I would lay you good money, not 39 billion, but I'd lay you good money that somebody will raise that issue in debate in both houses.
Sure. Right, so let me come to the money. Would you agree with the recent reports that the head of the NAO, Sir Amir Small, said that once the withdrawal agreement comes into force, the UK's commitments under that financial settlement, that kind of money we're just talking about, will be legally binding, and therefore they cannot be used as leverage regardless of the success or failure of negotiations on future relations. So in other words, we can't say we're not going to pay you the money once we agree to pay you the money.
Generally speaking, I will advise people when they're making legal judgments to read the contract first. And we haven't yet concluded the legal text. So it depends on what conditionalities are in the legal text. I don't know at this stage. And somewhere in there will be a reference to the future framework. So it depends on what the text says. We're not at that point.
Right. So
Thank you.
Just a tiny little point to follow up on that.
Yes.
Do you envisage, and I think you have said this on the record somewhere else, I'm just trying to find out if that's still the case. Do you envisage that the payments will be staggered over a period of time?
Yes. I mean, they relate to so many different components of the MFF and so on that they're quite hard to sort of pin down exactly, but I would expect them to take quite some years to conclude. I saw somewhere, and I actually don't know whether it's accurate. Somebody said something like 40 years, but I don't know if it's true.
I saw that too.
I don't know whether it's true or not, but it will be some years.
I think that relates to pensions, which is a long haul.
Long tail liabilities then.
What?
Long tail liabilities.
Long tail liability. You're not on a European pension as well, Jim?
Right, if we can go on from that to Jamie Selkirk.
Secretary of State, in your reply to our letter, you said that while the final terms of our future relationship can only be concluded once the UK has officially left the EU, we expect first to agree the terms of our future security and economic partnerships. Can you say what this will mean in practice?
Well, to some extent, my Lord, it's what I've been saying already, that we get to a substantive agreement in October if we hit the Commission's timetable, and then we detail that in legal terms between October and the point of departure. That's a target. Of course, you can never be sure you'll hit those targets. It's a negotiation after all. And the other thing I'd say, my Lord, is that whilst the economic partnership will probably not bite, as it were, until the 1st of January 2021, our aim is to get the defence security partnership in place as soon as we can. To have that bite as soon as we can.
Thank you. Lord Teverson.
Secretary, you described very, very well just now the challenges of the implementation period and everything that has to be done there. What I don't understand is why you agreed almost immediately to the 21-month European Commission proposal rather than trying to defend our own argument which I understand is the government's position, that it should have been 24 months. Wasn't that gave away something in a period that, as you say, is absolutely critical and is difficult, with little, I don't see anything in return, or it really creates a lot of issues, but not just for government, but for all those organisations that have to cope during that implementation period.
Well, firstly, we didn't commit to 24 months per se. We said round about 2 years.
But that was the ask, wasn't it? 2 years.
We said round about 2 years. The other thing is, I'm afraid, in a negotiation, a bird in the hand, given we had a tight timetable, and I suspect that if we had tried to go beyond December 2020, we would have been into the new MFF. Knowing our negotiating partners, I would have thought the bill for that last 3 months might have been quite big. Added to which, when I talked to commercial interests in the UK about this, their concern was over certainty by March, over and above the actual couple of months extra length. So it was a judgment call. It was a judgment call, which seemed to us a smart one to make.
Lord Knoll.
I just want to come back a bit to what you said about the European Union not able to agree a treaty with us while we're still members of it, which I have been scratching my head and been troubled over. In real life, of course, an agreement to agree on something is a very normal thing. And in European Union land, we've seen an agreement to agree as well. And we had the David Cameron negotiations, where he came back and he said, well, I've agreed some treaty changes, I've agreed it's going to happen in the future, they're binding in international law and they're going to be deposited at the UN, I remember. Now, I'm sure that very clever structure, which I never saw full details of, works. It must do, because he told it to us. Is it not going to be possible to use a structure like that, so there is the sort of certainty that Baroness Faulkner was talking about just now, that when all the cards fall on the table in March next year?
You'd have to do it. I mean, what he was talking about is a change in European treaties, in essence. Arbitrated by the ECJ and all the things that go with that. So that's not what we're after. We're after a free trade agreement. And we actually want third country status in this context. And as third country status, they can only do it from a third country.
Thank you. Lord Cromwell.
I think that segues quite neatly into what I would like to ask you about, which is on the 18th of April, this House passed an amendment requiring the government to negotiate a customs union and to make a statement on the outcome of that. On the 24th of April, evidence to this committee from the CBI and the TUC also favoured a customs union. And on the 26th of April, a backbench motion in the House of Commons called for an effective customs union. That and some of the media criticism of the government's proposal for a customs partnership suggests to me that Parliament and government are in disagreement. Are they? And if they are, how can that be reconciled?
Well, I think this point will come to a binding resolution. Well, firstly, I'm trying to think which amendment to the withdrawal bill you're talking to, because the last one I looked at was actually an undertaking to make a statement, but not a commitment to actually join a customs union. But I may be reading the wrong one. But you're right in this respect. And just one other thing, that there will be, in the course of make a report, sorry. There will be, in the course of primary legislation going through the House, some amendments down on the trade bill, for example, which relate to that. So whether I'm right about that or not, your substantive point stands, I think, that we were going to have to resolve this matter in the Commons and, of course, in the Lords as well. Now, the position of the government is very plain. We view leaving the European Union as meaning leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. We say that for a variety of reasons, one of which is that's what the British people were told in the referendum by both sides of the argument. There are many areas in the referendum debates where there are disputes about facts, Lord knows what else. But on this, it was plain. Mr Cameron, Mr Osborne, Mr Johnson and Mr Gove all said on the Marr programme within weeks of one another, this means that. So that's the first thing. It's a question of meeting the understanding of what we think is the understanding of the British people. The second thing, however, is relates to all of the other elements that form about it. You know, the control of borders, control of laws. You don't get that if you are in a customs union. By definition, you don't get control of your borders. But the third thing in this context is the economic judgment as to what the best outcome will be. Because the Labour Party, perfectly properly, argues, well, you know, we want to make the best economic case here. We want a Brexit for the 100, not the 48 or 52. And in the last 20 years, exports to the United Kingdom have gone from 60-40 to the European Union to almost 40-60 the other way. It's not 40-60 yet, but it will be probably by the end of the decade. So we have the fastest growing, largest component of our exports outside the Union. What being outside the customs union gives us is the right to control our own commercial policy, which means open up those markets that we've already got 60% of our exports going to. If we're inside the customs union, we forego that. And that is the primary economic benefit arising from departure. Now, the point, of course, is can we do that at the same time as maintaining frictionless or near frictionless trade with the European Union? You will see in the guidelines from March that they have asserted that they want tariff-free arrangement. That's the first step out of the way. The second step is how we deal with regulation, etc. And that's not even a customs union issue. That's a single market issue. And that will be the centrepiece, I suspect, for the negotiations that comes. Sorry for the rather long-winded answer, but the answer to your question, I think, is yes.
What, yes, that they are in disagreement, or yes, that they will be reconciled?
Well, I think that we will make these arguments when it comes to the primary legislation. Of course, we'll also make some arguments when some of the when we get into ping pong. Of course,
I mean, many of these arguments have been made on the floor.
Well, they've been made again,
and the amendment went the other way.
They've been made again in the Commons. I mean, I've had the pleasure of 2 bills so far on this process, Article 50, where we had quite a lot of ping pong there, and we may well, I expect we will have on not just this but on other issues on the withdrawal bill too.
Right, well, I think there's a delay with the trade bill in the other place as well, isn't there? But presumably, are you going to...
Well, there's a whole series of bills, about 4 bills which this has implication, and yeah, we're between committee and report stage, I think, on the trade bill from memory. It's not directly my bill. It's one of my sibling bills, if you like. I'm not quite sure what you call them.
I think we could spend a lot of time on this, but just if I can jump off to one side slightly.
Yeah.
The other thing that CBI and the TUC said to us, one of the reasons that they favoured a customs union was that they saw it as the only way to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't think they're right. I mean, the situation in Northern Ireland as it stands. Firstly, I think one always has to start from the memory that it's not a non-border. There is a border there. There's a border on excise. There's a border on tax, whether it's VAT or corporation tax. There's a currency border. There's a judicial border. Right? The border works very well, invisibly, as it stands, dealing with all those things. And for example, on customs and excise, it's really dealt with by intelligence-led operations north and south of the border, normally away from the border itself, more than 20 kilometres away. Now, in the event that we get a free trade agreement on even on the basis of the opening guidelines from the European Union, there will be no tariffs. So from that point of view, it's not a tariff issue. It's back to a regulatory issue and or a rules of origin issue. Rules of origin is related to customs union, but it won't be the biggest issue. I imagine it'll be regulation. And that's a single market issue rather than the customs union issue. And I don't think anybody's arguing that at the moment.
I think we may revert to some of these again in the
I'm sure you will.
But before that, we might ask Baroness Films.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Secretary of State, what assessment have the government undertaken to measure the cost implications for small and medium-sized businesses, particularly those that will be caught up in the supply chains when we leave Brexit, if there is no customs union?
Well, we haven't yet got an agreement related to this, so it's a bit hard to make the assessment. We've said at the end of the process we will present both houses an economic assessment of the impacts of all elements of this. What we're seeking to do is to minimise those costs for all businesses, small, medium and large. And we do that by a variety of mechanisms. One of them is authorised economic operators. That's principally for large businesses. One part of it is having no tariffs. One part of it is electronic pre-notification, which is not too difficult. Not too difficult, but it requires some work. But which will make the crossing of the border more easily facilitated. So there's a whole series of things we're going to do to minimise that. Now, when we get near to the end piece of the negotiation, we'll be able to make the assessment you're talking about, but not at the moment.
May I just follow just that with a small question on, if that is the case, then how are those businesses going to start actually getting their budgets prepared for cost implications that they don't know are coming around the corner?
I would concern myself more with the practicalities of the budget, because I think the issue we have to deal with is how they're going to do things like electronic pre-notification. How will freight and typically, let me pick a couple of examples out. One of the things that will be an issue, irrespective, post-departure, will be the issue of rules of origin. That's quite something for a small company to do. That's done for people by the British Chambers of Commerce, relatively economically. So that would be one issue. We'd also have to look and see the extent to which the existing freight forwarder community, who deal with most of this, if you're a small business sending a small amount of stuff abroad, you don't do it on your own truck and your own thing. If you do, you're probably capable of doing this as an economic operator, as a trusted trader. You do it through the intermediaries, and that's the sort of people we'll be talking to.
And just to...
They have to pay, absolutely.
To us, they will have to pay.
And our aim would to make that as economic as we can.
I was just going to make the point myself. I take it, so we don't lose it, that you would accept that there's also a concomitant level of government expenditure which will be required in order to set these systems in place.
Well, as you will be aware, the Treasury has set aside $3 billion so far, and we haven't spent all that. We've spent about $750 million.
Thank you. Lord Teverson.
Yes, Secretary, one of the things I think everybody's have the same view on is trying to remain with the internal energy market, which I think the Prime Minister's mentioned. Certainly my own subcommittee did an inquiry into this. This is one of the big asks. Yeah. And, of course, in Ireland it's completely integrated. And we have a whole interconnector programme that's still rolled out in terms of investment.
Yeah, still going on.
Part of our energy. Yeah. I'm interested to understand whether you think that investment in interconnectors will continue. But from the European point of view, it would seem to me that they would define trying to remain in the internal energy market as cherry picking, rather than as so if you're out of the single market, because that's part of it, you're out anyway. So I just wondered, are you more optimistic on that, or do you feel that this is something that we might be able to achieve at least to some degree?
Well, I would certainly hope to achieve it. That's what we would aim for. Bear in mind that there's not a sort of wall around Europe in terms of energy. They buy energy in from outside and lots of other places. The interconnectors, if from memory, and I'm afraid it is from memory, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were the buyers last winter and the winter before from the French primarily. So there is an interest for them too.
Actually, there's a hope that we might. That's going to turn around. That is one of the big hopes. But the history has been that way.
And therefore there's an interest in both directions. You all know better than most. It's not just a question of cost and revenue. It's also a question of stabilisation. It's a question of flywheel effects and so on. With respect to Ireland, we are very, very engaged on trying to get that right. That's why we want to get on to the future economic partnership, so we can talk about that. That's one of the north-south strands that's very important, and actually incredibly important to Northern Ireland in that context, because that's the way the dependency runs at the moment. So, that's what we're aiming for.
That leads us very neatly into the next line of questioning.
You seem to have segued all these questions, Mr. Chairman.
They haven't been pre-rehearsed with you for the avoidance of doubt in this way, anyway. Certainly not the sequencing.
Some members of this committee went to Northern Ireland and Derry and Londonderry and the borders a little while ago, a few weeks ago, and the sense we got, the closer we got to the border, the more we had a sense of real anxiety on the part of business people on both sides, politicians, local politicians on both sides of the border, about what the implications of Brexit might be for them. And I know you've just been there yourself. I think the first time in your capacity as Secretary of State. I wondered if you had that same sense that on and around the border itself there is real concern about the possible implications of Brexit for them.
There's undoubtedly nervousness. There's no doubt about that. Economic nervousness. There was on one of the roads we went down, there was a sign saying, this road will be blocked in the event of a hard border, which is in the event of a hard Brexit, which is not true. I can't imagine the circumstance in which that road, any of the roads, would be blocked. But yes, of course, that concern is there, and that's one of the things we need to deal with. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. But I reiterate, there is a border there at the moment. It's not visible. But it does work, and a fair chunk of the time I was over there this time. And by the way, it didn't look very different from the previous several times I've been. Some of my briefing was from the police and the various services and so on, who were very forthright about it, how it works.
And can you, just going on from that, there have been a certain amount in the newspapers, and of course one doesn't believe everything one reads from the newspapers, about the government's proposals for the border having been, as it were, sort of rejected or questioned by the Commission. Can you just say a little bit more about that, and whether that's true, and whether there is a kind of plan B, as it were, for the governments if the proposals that you put forward are not acceptable to the Commission? The two proposals
put forward were the streamlined customs system, which is essentially the one based on technology and existing techniques used elsewhere, like trusted traders I was referring to before. And the other one is the new customs partnership, which in essence assumes keeping the common external tariff barrier, as it were, around the UK, and then rebating it to assist people who buy things for the UK from people with whom we've done trade deals. The Commission did push back on both. The basis of the pushback was slightly different. They were concerned about how you'd run the new customs partnership on the one hand, and they were, in the context of Northern Ireland, objecting to the notion of exempting small businesses for the streamlined arrangement. That was there will be other bits I have not remembered, but those were the two primary pushbacks from memory.
Can I just ask one final question on I know others have got other questions on Ireland. I just wonder what your own sort of relations are with the Taoiseach, with Simon Coveney, with others in the Irish government who are dealing with these issues, I imagine, as you are day by day, and worried about them as you are.
I've not met the new Taoiseach. I met the old one, not the new one. But Simon Coveney I've met a number of times. I get on with him perfectly well. We obviously have a different stance on these things, but as you will remember from your old career, you could be perfectly friendly with people without being on the same side.
It's rather important to do that.
It is rather important. You and I are both believers in old-fashioned diplomacy. We've had this conversation before.
Yeah. Thank you.
Baroness Brown.
Thank you. Because of the government's expressed promise that there would be no hard border, no equipment that you can see, no barriers, no police checks and things, on the UK side of the border, it's been suggested to us that the challenge then is that if the Irish government did not find that a satisfactory outcome, that the onus would be on them to erect whatever sort of barrier they thought they or the EU felt they should erect. Has that actual conversation taken place
No, not in those terms. To cite the issue I was just referring to Lord Jay about, the concern amongst the Commission is this will be an external border for them, and they do not want to either have a porosity in that border or indeed a precedent for other elements of their external border. So that I think is the logic behind it. To be honest, I cannot imagine a circumstance where an Irish government would put up a hard border. It's part of our task to make all of this work without that, and so it's both sides. I quite explicitly don't put responsibility on either side in this. I think it's better to treat it as a joint problem. It's better. It's much more smart.
Baroness Brown, if I may.
Secretary of State, we've taken quite a lot of evidence about border control for various types of border in Europe and how it works. And we've also heard from a number of witnesses, indeed 2 MEPs yesterday, who both had rather different ideas about what there might or might not be as a hard border. But I think you've been absolutely clear on this. I think you've said a hard border excludes any physical infrastructure related to checks.
At the border.
At the border.
At the border.
So you would exclude from that even any cameras for number plate recognition or anything like that?
The thing to understand, I think, in the context of the history of Northern Ireland is that there used to be border posts before the Troubles. They became the first point of attack, if you like.
We like you, have done the visit and met and talked about those things.
I hate to tell you how many times I've done that visit, but as Lord Jay says, beforehand, not since. The point doesn't matter really what it is. Camera on a pole, building, whatever. It's not wise to create
that's
that.
Great. And I think
it doesn't. But the point, I reiterate the point I made before, which is that the existing border is done by intelligence-led policing and customs regulation, and that's done by a variety of mechanisms. I mean, intelligence comes from all sorts of sources, including, ANPR cameras back in Belfast. There's a variety of mechanisms. They don't require a border structure.
But if I may go on, we took evidence from both the Norwegian and the Swiss border force and customs authority, and our Swiss colleagues were themselves very keen to move towards technological solutions at the border, and indeed said they were involved in understanding what the opportunities were, but they still thought such systems would take up to a decade to develop and implement. And so in that context, we haven't been convinced, I think, that there is an immediate technological solution to the Irish land border, and something that could be put in place before the end of the transition period. So I'd be interested in your comment on that. But also, are we discussing with the EU, or indeed planning, any kind of trials of these technological solutions at the border? And should we not be trying to set something up?
Not yet. You'll remember from my previous appearances before this committee that the EU's stance on not talking about any part of the future partnership until we get to a certain point. So we haven't been able to have that conversation yet. Let me make another point to you as well.
But do we have a proposal being got ready that we would like
we
to
have? We have some ideas, exactly. And some of that will come out in the near future. Now, some of it we did publish last year. We published 14 papers. You've got them all, Lord Chairman, including a paper on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and also a paper on customs. But let me just make a point to you about preceding or pre-existing border arrangements. Firstly, most of them are more than 15 years old. Right? What's been put in place. Now, the last 15, 20 years has been a huge change in all sorts of technology, electronic, online technology and so on. But the other thing that happened in that last 20 years was 9/11. And so border security has altered. So when I went to the American-Canadian border, and I went there because actually I knew that border as well. I'd sold goods across it, in times of old. That security there was dominated by 9/11 related issues, security issues, and it was old technology. This is not the case today, and actually even now, electronic pre-notification is pretty common. Authorised economic operators are well understood. There are not very many of them in this country because so far we've used other customs facilitation mechanisms, unlike Germany, where there are a vast number of them. So they're all well-tested procedures. The main issue here is time to get them in. Now, I don't think it's 10 years, but we're only talking a few years. So we've got to raise some hands.
Thank you. Baroness Armstrong.
Good afternoon.
Hello again.
Hello. It does seem to me that the Northern Ireland issue is sort of symptomatic of the real problems that there are that need to be faced. And we need people who understand the history, but also understand the Good Friday Agreement, and actually make sure that we don't go backwards. We haven't yet got total peace, and we need to keep working at it. So when we hear that the government advertised jobs in the new border agency, saying in Northern Ireland, saying that people had to have a British passport, you worry about that. Because the Good Friday Agreement allows you to live legally in Northern Ireland with an Irish passport.
Allows you to choose when you're there. Or absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of the rights guaranteed.
That's what I mean. You're allowed to live there legally with just an Irish passport. And I just give that as an anecdote to say we have to be very careful how we handle this.
Oh, yeah.
Virtually everyone we saw, other than the DUP, when we were in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the border, said they didn't know how it would work without a customs union or a customs arrangement. And there was real concern from people who weren't necessarily in an economic relationship, except of course it does end up as an economic relationship. We went to the new cancer hospital where people were going locally from the Republic to the hospital that was actually in Northern Ireland, and had been jointly paid for by both, and ambulances cross the border all the time, health facilities cross the border all the time. Yeah. So these things are more tricky than simply an economic relationship.
No, I agree entirely.
And it's how are you actually going to demonstrate that we understand this and that we're on top of this. We met a dairy company on the border, and they were complaining to us that we were the first politicians that they'd seen. Now, we don't really regard ourselves as politicians in this end, but, it's that sort of thing that is really difficult.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So what are you going to do to actually make sure that across government and across the Northern Ireland, non-government, that they actually are paying daily attention to them?
Well, you allude elliptically to one of the issues we have to deal with, which is there's no Northern Ireland executive, which does make this much more difficult than it otherwise would. Some of the solutions we have in mind are really only doable by a Northern Ireland executive, not by a UK government, because of the need for local sensitivities on this. Similarly, we are looking at a whole series of issues cross-border. Let me pick you a sort of, in a way it's trivial, but not if you are the subject of it. You're allowed, if you live near the border, to go and take a prescription to the local pharmacist. Doesn't matter which side of the border it is. You might be one side, you go to the other side. And that arises from a 2011 directive on that. And a whole series of that sort of thing which will be carried through. Now, this is where part of the controversy of the withdrawal bill comes up, because we've got to take 40 years of laws, including laws like that, and turn them into reality in a couple of years, you know. Hence all the argument about using secondary legislation. But no, I'm acutely conscious of that. I mean, when I was there last week, one of the places I went to, I didn't just go to the border, one place I went to was home for autistic children. Now, the point about it, I mean, I have an interest here, just my own family, but the point about it was funded by both North and South, and its outreach program, which is actually much more powerful now than it is again North and South all over the island. So we're acutely conscious of those things. Right at the beginning of this process, it was us that first said. I mean, I don't think we had to push very hard, but us that first said we need to put Ireland into the withdrawal agreement.
The withdrawal agreement has that aspect to it, which is people are now calling the backstop option.
Yeah.
But there is significant disagreement between the UK government and the European Union and the Irish government as to what that means. And one of the phrases that has led to confusion is the UK will maintain full alignment. When we met Simon Coveney, he said they understood, and I was then reminded as to what you had said at a previous meeting, that the EU operates from precedents and legal statute or whatever. And he said, we have therefore a particular understanding of full alignment, which is why we agreed to the word, because that is a phrase that's used in the treaties for accession countries. So we know what full alignment means.
But plainly we're not an accession country, and the preceding words that were removed were, I mean, I've forgotten the actual words, but they effectively related to harmonisation. And they weren't acceptable to us. So it's plain that we were not talking about harmonisation. Now, we will have to address this for each of the north-south strands, and that's why something like what we do on agriculture, which agribusiness, agri-food, be the biggest individual issue, will be quite important. Which is why I said to you at the beginning of this exercise, this question, the Northern Ireland Executive's non-existence at the moment is a problem for us, But because at the moment, Ireland, the island of Ireland, is a single epidemiological area. This goes back, you'll remember, my Lord Chairman, to my delightful time in the Foreign Office when we dealt with BSE, and we had to do that. Now that works well, and that may deal with some of that. But also, we've said what we're talking about is outcome effect, not the guarantee that we're going to be inside the single market, which was their interpretation, but that we are not going to have our food any less safe, our farm animals any less well treated. It's in terms of those absolutes. So that's how we saw it. But this is exactly where the argument and the negotiation is right now. That's what it's about.
Yeah. I would make the point that when we were there, a lot of the people we talked to in the north and the south were really concerned that it looked almost as if the withdrawal agreement was unravelling a few days and weeks later as different interpretations came. And it really does seem to me important that when you're agreeing something and announcing something, there's some common purpose, common agreement. And particularly around Ireland, given how much some people like to misinterpret.
Yeah, well, and you're quite right, and we see that latter tendency sometimes more than once. As well, And I can remind you, immediately after the December meeting, I was asked, is this a legally binding agreement? I said no, it's a clear statement of intent, but no, it's not. There was uproar. Of course, it's not. It's not the legal treaty yet, But even stating the truth causes annoyance, I'm afraid. So there wasn't any indication that we weren't going to carry through with it. It was just a statement of fact.
And I just want to ask a very techie question.
You're frightening me now.
You've agreed... No, it's parliamentary stuff. You agreed last week with the Commons Committee that they would get advance sight of the mapping exercise of areas of north-south cooperation, and we're simply wanting to be assured that we'll get the same privilege.
I'll say just on that, Mr. Chairman, my Lord Chairman, that we've got to wait for it to be completed first, and it's still underway. But yeah, when it comes, you'll get it the same way.
Baroness Faulkner, quickly.
Just on that, on the backstop, regulatory alignment, I wonder whether you'd be able to clarify for us, when you say when the text said the UK will maintain full alignment, does that mean for the whole of the UK?
No, it related directly to the, firstly, we're not going to allow differences, as it were, in the Irish Sea. That's the first thing. But the reference was directly to the north-south strands. That's what it relates to, and it's a limited group of things.
Thank you. One other on this. There was an agreement, or the text was, that about alignment of regulatory outcomes. And some people in Dublin are taking a slightly different view, where there's a suggestion that this may be rather less facilitative than it might be. I mean, we all know what you're driving at in trying to get an objective through, which is broader. I better not use the word equivalence, and it has a particular resonance, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Now, if people stand on the letter of that, it may mean something more literal. Is that something you'll be able to work your way through?
I think so. Look, we're in the middle of a negotiation. Of course, and this is almost three-way, because it's Ireland Commission, implicitly the other 26, and ourselves, so more than three-way. But it's the middle of a negotiation. We expect there to be interpretive differences along the way, which we've got to resolve. That's my job.
I think at this point we will move on, because we're conscious that we've had one division. I hope you can allow us a little leeway on your timetable, but we want to get through a lot yet. More witty.
Yes, in a sense this goes back to the sequencing point, and it's designed to ascertain just how much disagreement you think there still is. When you say 75-25, 75% there, or Michel Barnier says that, that relates to the withdrawal treaty and possibly a general declaration on whether you want to go to future relationships. And even that seems a little exaggerated. There is no way, most people tell us, where we could get, for example, a trade treaty, 75% agreed by October or indeed by March 2019. And your view that by 2019 we will have everything on paper and it will just be a question of implementation is not one I think any of our witnesses have ever concurred with. We've also had the Mansion House speech on the one hand, and we've had the guidelines from the European Council. Michel Barnier has now said, we've set out our position, and it's now up to the UK to set out their vision for future relationships. Our reading, I think, of the two documents is that they're not very close at the moment in certain key respects and certain key psychology. So how far in your judgment do you think we're apart in relation to the future relationship?
It's hard to give a sort of demonstrable answer to that. It's hard because we throughout all of this process, the Commission has laid down some lines of argument, then said the UK hasn't told us what it wants. Then we tell them what it wants, and it's not enough detail, and so on. This is a part of the process that we go through. They try and use time pressure. These are all just negotiating mechanisms. They're perfectly legitimate, perfectly reasonable. But at the moment, what we are endeavouring to do with them is to get an agreement on the progress on the future economic partnership. You're right, and 75% didn't apply to that, by the way. I don't think it meant that at all. And that we get started on that in parallel. Right? So that's the first thing. We have to get it in parallel, because if we try and do, let us say, for the sake of argument, 45 different subjects in sequence, I will be dead and buried, and probably my grandchildren will be dead and buried before we get there. We've got to do it in parallel. So that's the first thing. We've got to get that agreement. We're on that now. I think we're going to be there in soonish. The next thing, of course, to bear in mind, and this is why I think the advice you're getting from people is not right, is we start uniquely in terms of international agreements, trade agreements, at identity, at the same place. There's not a product differentiation between us where we start. The question then becomes, how do we maintain the following pair of apparently inconsistent issues? On the one hand, we want to give back control. We want Parliament to decide on what the future regulations should be. And on the other hand, we want to maintain alignment in outcome terms with the European Union and let them have the confidence that they will not be undercut in some way. They are, some of them are terrified of this sort of wild west of Anglo-Saxon deregulation that we all live amongst here. And of course, we plainly don't. But that we have to deal with that concern. And the mechanism we're looking at there is a mechanism they used many times before. And I say that because it's important that they understand the mechanism from their own experience. And that mechanism is the dispute resolution mechanism, which Baroness Kennedy started with, which is fair to both sides and has appropriate defences for both sides. Now, once we get that structure broadly agreed, then we'll make a lot of progress on the goods front. We've got a similar sort of issue to deal with on things like financial services and services. That may be a little more complicated, to say the least. But we've already got an in-house design on that, which we'll be putting out in the public domain at some point.
Thank you.
Yes. So we'll be putting
that out
in the public domain at some point. Yeah.
At some point.
At an appropriate point. Yeah.
Lord Warmer.
Sorry. On that point, what do you have now in relation to services and financial services?
As I said, we'll put it out in the public domain at the appropriate point, not now.
I thought you said shortly.
No, I said I did not. I'm sure you've got a recording, my Lord Chairman. I did not say shortly.
But services, not merely financial services, is a very important part for the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And it's no good having a free trade, even a free trade understanding, if that doesn't cover services.
In our interest, services are a very large component of our exports. So clearly we want to maintain the most open access to services possible. There is not, strictly speaking, a single market in services really in the European Union now. I mean, this is quite small in terms of its impact. But yeah, we'll want to get the most liberal arrangement on services we can.
But Mr. Barnier told us, and I think he also made this point in his Hamburg remarks recently, that the way he looks at the relationship is 4 pillars. Free trade, bilateral agreements on areas of common interest, and justice, and home affairs cooperation and security cooperation. Is that approach something with which the United Kingdom government agrees, and is that the basis on which you're seeking to take forward discussions?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that approach. It seems perfectly sensible, and what are the implications of it? One of the things I think I said earlier is that we would like to bring some of the security, defence, foreign affairs elements into effect more quickly than by December 2020. We may or may not be able to do it, but if the 4 pillars means they've all got to happen at the same time, we'd probably argue that. So it depends what the 4 pillars mean. There are evidently those 4 separate entities that we need to negotiate.
He's used those words, and I assume that you yourself and your colleagues will have sought to understand
not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, the Lord Jay will remember the various pillars of the European Union is a standard phrase used. In the old days, we had the pillar which was decided by qualified majority voting, and the others which were not. Now they're all QMB, I think, or pretty much. So that's a normal European phrase. It depends exactly what he means by it, and I think we'll only engage on that once we engage on what the future partnership is.
Now, can you, Secretary, say let us have till 6:10 in view of the the division.
Can I make it 6:05 because I do have another appointment 6:15?
Right. We must, I think, all respect that. Lord Whitty, very briefly, if
you replied to Lord Wilmer, you said the 4 pillars would be one way of doing it. But how much detail will we know on the future agreement as of October? And how, we keep talking about a meaningful vote in this House, how are you going to get political backing, parliamentary backing for that?
Well, by getting a good deal is the first answer to that. That's exactly right. So there's no. Again, a reminder.
How much detail will Parliament have to take a decision? How much detail will Parliament have to take a decision?
We will get as much. Well, firstly, the withdrawal agreement itself will, by then, hopefully be a full legal text. That's the intention, clear intention. The future relationship, it will be very substantive. It has to be from everybody's point of view. I mean, not just us. I mean, I think you'll find that Angela Merkel has said that she wants to see a lot of detail in October, which for me is a good thing, because if the biggest member state is pushing for a lot of detail, then that's an incentive for the Commission to do it too.
At this point, I think a plea all round for short questions, short answers, so we can get through it all. Baroness Neville, that's not an implied criticism, you've been very helpful. Baroness Neville Rowe.
Secretary of State, in view of what you've just said, does the European Parliament proposal for a UK-EU association agreement have any merit? In particular, Guy Verhofstadt made, I think, what might be viewed as a constructive point, that it can be applied before ratification by member states, and avoids the need for a sort of Swiss-style relationship with perhaps over 100 agreements.
In principle, I see no problem with it, but again, it depends exactly what you mean by it. That's the point I made to my lord before on the issue of pillars. Some association agreements are sort of stepping stones to membership. You've got Ukraine, for example, and so it depends what's included. We would not, for example, want to see it bring ECJ jurisdiction in, but as a sort of concept, I have no intrinsic objection to it. I mean, Guy Verhofstadt has played an interesting role in this. I mean, he's been very supportive, for example, on issues relating to citizens' rights, the ones that the Baroness raised, and he's thoughtful. He's an ex-Prime Minister of Belgium. And so I do listen to what he says fairly carefully. Sometimes even when I'm watching him racing his antique Aston Martin at Silverstone.
Right. So if we just look ahead a little bit further, we had a Norwegian parliamentarian here recently who told us that Brexit would turn the UK from an EU member into a lobbyist. Have you given any thought to the mechanisms going forward, and is that a fair remark?
A lobbyist?
If we can convert that, there's an issue about resources and the amount of effort we're going to have to put in to maintain our interest in Brussels.
Oh, I see.
Perhaps you may want to reply to now or by correspondence. If you
Actually, we could do by correspondence. I mean, we have given a tiny bit of thought to that, because obviously at some point, once we've left, the status of our press was out. And we have given a little bit of thought to that. Let me write, to save time, my Lord Chairman, let me write on it.
Yes, Lord Liddell, I think, at the end.
Secretary of State, just on what we're going to have in October.
Yeah.
And after all, what you agree between March, I don't know whether you agree with this comment, but what you agree by March isn't really relevant to the question of parliamentary approval of Brexit, is it? Because it's what is available when we take the vote on the withdrawal agreement. So we keep being told that all we will have is a political declaration. We've also been told by people in Brussels that this political declaration will not be a legally binding document. So so it won't bind the parties to the future trade talks. Now that means that the risk there, obviously, is that in this political declaration you can include all kinds of political compromise language, which means different things to different people, and doesn't therefore, allows claims to be made about what we've won, as it were, in these negotiations, which then prove to be bogus. Now, do you accept that there is a risk here?
Well, I don't think it's a material one, and I say it for the following reason. Firstly, of course, you are hearing the negotiating stance. Always remember when you're talking to all these people, they're not presenting you with scientific facts, they're presenting you with a negotiating stance, right? And their negotiating stance is, of course, nothing's binding on them, of course, but their favourite phrase is nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. The ratification process for the withdrawal agreement, it will not be instantaneous, for a start, there's at least two phases to it. One, the initial debate in your House and in the Commons. The other is the withdrawal and implementation bill, which will go through, which will actually put that into effect. So the House has a fairly long time to deliberate on this before we get to the conclusion of it. Also, as I just said, I was citing Angela Merkel, who I read in the newspaper. I can't. Again, it's always a risk of believing what you read in newspapers, but who is said to have said that she wants to see details in this. There's a reason for that, because go back to the original arguments of where the negotiating leverage is. Between them, the European Union has sales to the United Kingdom of way over 300 billion a year. Ours is about 200 billion to them. Now, this will affect their access to us as well as our access to them. So they want that pinned down. And certainly on goods, the more difficult area, services and financial services, where the balance is the other way, but it's not hugely, it's not bigger than that, it doesn't overwhelm it. So, of course, we are going to have to manoeuvre, no, that's the wrong word, we're going to have to manage the transition from the political agreement to the legal agreement, and some of it will have hiccups, but I think, broadly speaking, we'll have a very, very good idea of where we're going to be at the end.
We have, as you know, Secretary of State, a continuing interest in some of the constitutional ramifications of this. Yeah. And I'm going to ask two of my colleagues to raise disparate, but I think related questions, Lord Selkirk and then Lord Woolmer. And perhaps you can answer them together, and then I'll move to a wrap-up question and conclusion.
Secretary of State, can I ask you, what is the basis of the United Kingdom government's agreement with the Welsh government regarding returning powers from Brussels, devolved competencies in UK frameworks, and how can the continuing impasse with the Scottish Parliament be resolved?
I think we'll ask Lord Woolmer to put his questions on Gibraltar as well at the same time.
Yes, the European Union's position on Gibraltar is that no agreement between the EU and the United Kingdom will apply to the territory of Gibraltar without an agreement between the Kingdom of Spain and the United Kingdom. How do you interpret the asterisk that they use to keep that very much ball in the game? And what's your understanding of Spain's aims? And do you really, in relation to Gibraltar, can you envisage them using this to block agreement?
Well, let me deal with Wales first. I'll come back to that. Firstly, this relates to Clause 11 and the amendment to Clause 11. As it's been laid. It hasn't been voted on in your House yet.
Just finish it.
Let me just be very quick in that case, my Lord. I'm sorry I have to go do that.
I think I'm going to waive my final question. So,
okay, and just say we've got an agreement with the Welsh government that they will recommend an LCM, which is good. We are, I think, arriving at an agreement with them with respect to their continuity bill, and I think basically from that point of view we're at a good place in terms of their acceptance of our intent to devolve many powers to them and retain some for the United Kingdom. I'm sorry for the shortness of the answers.
And Gibraltar, quickly.
Gibraltar, very quickly. We are in quite lengthy official-to-official negotiations with them. We're also keeping the Gibraltar government themselves heavily involved in it. There are a whole range of issues that have come up, and again, it might be better, Chairman, rather than I bounce this, if I write to you on this one and give you a proper
perfectly happy.
In negotiations with who? Spain or the?
Well, we are in official-to-official discussions. I said, not negotiations with them, with actually a number of countries, but Spain obviously is the nearest one, and we're in and we keep the Gibraltar government in the loop on that. They're heavily involved in that.
Secretary of State, we need to wind up, and I do understand that as a former whip. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your courtesy in getting us a quick response to our letter of the 19th. Mm-hmm. We do appreciate it, and we need this dialogue to continue in a positive way. Secondly, huge thanks for your contribution this afternoon. It has been helpful, and we will reflect on it. And we have got through all our business, except for two questions I have, which are not fast balls, and I'll put into correspondence, which relate to your notice to the service of documents during the transition implementation periods and the joint committee, at which point, order.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my Lord, and you're helping keeping up my record as the lead appearer before select committees.
Indeed. Right.